Picture a woman. She's sitting entirely alone in this dimly lit, quiet room.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. And her hands are weathered, like they show the immense physical toll of a lifetime of manual labor. And she's working with this incredible, almost, I don't know, transcendent level of focus.
I can picture it.
So from the moment the very first light of dawn creeps through her window, she is meticulously spinning a thread of yarn. She gathers all these raw, chaotic fibers, maybe wool or flax, and she twists them. She binds them together. She applies just the absolute perfect amount of tension using a wooden drop spindle. The work requires her to pour her energy, her time, and her undivided attention into creating this strong, cohesive thread.
It's a real labor of love, a real investment of self.
Exactly. And every single fiber relies on the friction and the proximity of the others to hold together. By late afternoon, it is a work of art, a testament to patience and endurance. But then, evening falls. The light fades. And this bizarre psychological shift happens.
This is where it gets dark.
It really does.
Yeah.
She sits down with that very same spool of tightly wound, perfect yarn, and with her own two hands, she begins to deliberately, methodically pull it apart.
Wow.
Yeah. She undoes every careful knot. She frays every single strand, tearing the bonds apart until she has reduced the entire day's agonizingly hard work into just a useless, chaotic pile of shredded fibers.
The profound psychological horror of that image is really difficult to shake.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, watching someone engage in that level of focused, intentional self-destruction, it triggers this deep cognitive dissonance. The human brain naturally recoils.
Right. We want it to make sense.
We demand a reason. We inherently want to understand the motive behind destroying the very mechanism of survival or beauty that someone has just exhausted themselves trying to build.
Well, the absurdity is the point. Welcome to the deep dive. The scenario we just painted, it isn't some obscure piece of ancient surrealist fiction, nor is it, a clinical observation of a mental breakdown.
Far from it.
It is actually one of the most profound, urgent, and devastatingly accurate political and social warnings ever recorded. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a fascinating and highly complex piece of archival philosophy.
And it's a vital one for where we are today.
Absolutely. We are unpacking Lecture 9 out of 15 from the Tului Islam Digital Archive. Specifically, we are exploring the renowned 20th century scholar Allama Parwez's rationalist synthesis of Surah An-Nahl, verses 91 through 93.
Right, and to establish the framework for our analysis today, we are utilizing this specific historical archive to conduct what is essentially a forensic examination of the ethics of the social contract.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why a society would tear itself apart, we first have to look at how it builds its foundations.
Exactly. Parwez's work provides this rigorous, really unsentimental critique of the dark side of political power. And he looks at the inherent, almost gravitational, self-destructive nature of empires.
The physics of human societies, basically.
Yes, the physics, the fundamental, inescapable laws of cause and effect that govern whether a civilization actually manages to maintain its structural integrity or whether it just collapses under the weight of its own internal contradictions.
So before examining the unraveling of the thread, we have to put the thread itself under a microscope. Right?
Yeah.
We have to look at the raw materials of human civilization.
Which is a daunting task.
It is. But in the context of a functioning society, that thread is justice. It represents the agreements, the invisible social contracts, the treaties, and the laws that perform the miraculous task of holding millions of self-interested individuals together.
Right, keeping the state stable.
Exactly. But the source material completely upends the modern orthodox understanding of what actually constitutes justice.
It really does. Parwez launches this devastating deconstruction of our over-reliance on man-made legalism. I mean, in the contemporary world, we operate under this massive collective assumption. We equate the law directly with justice.
Like they're the exact same word.
Right. The prevailing logic dictates that if a society possesses the bureaucratic trappings of order, a written constitution, a parliament, an active judiciary, a police force,
then boom, you have a just society.
Exactly. But the lecture shatters this illusion of human law. It posits that man-made legal justice is structurally flawed from its very inception.
Because humans are flawed.
And biased. Human laws are drafted, ratified, and interpreted by those who already hold power, specifically to insulate and expand that very power.
They are confined by the inescapable parameters of human bias, right?
Yeah.
resource hoarding, the primitive instinct for self-preservation at the expense of the outgroup.
Exactly. And the text grounds this high-level philosophical critique in a devastatingly recognizable everyday scenario.
Yeah.
It asks us to look at the architectural and social realities of a modern metropolis.
Oh, the footpath anecdote. I mean, the source mentions cities like Karachi or Delhi, but the dynamic applies seamlessly to New York, London, Paris, you name it.
Any major city, yeah.
So imagine this towering, state-of-the-art, 6-story luxury residential building. The interior is just a fortress of comfort. Plush carpets, climate-controlled environments, private security cordons.
A literal bubble of wealth.
A bubble. Yet directly outside the polished glass doors of this building, literally on the concrete footpath at street level, human beings are sleeping. Entire families, disenfranchised, displaced, sleeping on cardboard in the shadow of concentrated luxury.
And the purely legalistic approach to this massive disparity exposes the exact void Parwez is highlighting.
How so?
Well, inevitably, the city administration or the residents of the luxury building decide that the people residing on the footpath constitute an eyesore, right? Or a disruption to commerce or a vague security threat.
So they call the cops.
Right. The municipal authorities step in and issue an executive order. They declare that the footpath must be cleared immediately. And crucially, they execute this sweep entirely within the established boundaries of the law.
It's all completely legal.
Completely. The operation is justified under the banner of the interest of the state, or the maintenance of public order, or just enforcing mundane municipal zoning codes.
So from the sterile mechanical viewpoint of a lawyer or a city planner, justice has operated flawlessly.
The machine did its job.
Right. The municipal code explicitly prohibits unauthorized sleeping on a public thoroughfare. Individuals were found violating that code. The enforcement apparatus removed the violators. The thoroughfare is restored. The equation balances.
Technically, yes, the legal equation balances perfectly. The system executed its programming. However, the source text argues that this execution is entirely devoid of a concept known in this framework as Ihsan.
Ihsan. Let's dig into that.
Yeah, the closest translation of Ihsan in this context encompasses substantive human empathy, absolute equity, and the pursuit of a genuinely beautiful and compassionate social balance.
So it's not just following the rules, it's the spirit behind them.
Exactly. The application of legal justice successfully sanitized the physical street, but it did absolutely nothing to diagnose or heal the gaping systemic wound of economic inequality.
It didn't ask why those people were sleeping on the concrete to begin with.
Not at all. It asked no structural questions about the socio-economic forces driving human beings to sleep next to vacant luxury real estate. It simply erased the most visible, inconvenient symptom of the disease to assuage the discomfort of the powerful.
And a society attempting to anchor its long-term survival solely on this brand of cold, mechanical, fundamentally biased legalism. It's constructing its entire civilization on a fault line.
I think a fault line that will eventually rupture.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here, because the immediate counterargument feels incredibly practical to me.
Go for it.
If we abandon the rigid adherence to these laws, even the ones that feel devoid of Ihsan or human empathy, don't we just invite sheer chaos?
That's the classic fear.
Right. Imagine a society where every citizen or every police officer decides which municipal codes to enforce based on their own subjective, fluctuating feelings of empathy on any given Tuesday. The entire civic infrastructure seizes up.
It would be paralyzed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A flawed, rigid law that applies a baseline of order seems inherently superior to the alternative of total anarchy. Think of a dense city grid with traffic lights.
Okay.
Sitting at a red light in the middle of the night when no one is around feels frustrating. It's pointless. It lacks nuance. But the moment we decide that traffic lights are optional suggestions based on how much of a hurry we are in, the intersections turn into bloodbaths. Order, even cold order, preserves life.
The defense of structural order is a vital component of political theory, absolutely. And Parwez does not dismiss the necessity of systems. He is absolutely not advocating for the dissolution of civil codes or the embrace of anarchy.
Oh, so he's not saying tear down the traffic lights.
Not at all. The core of his argument is about the insufficiency of a system that relies exclusively on human-dictated legalism while ignoring human dignity.
I see.
When a legal apparatus consistently operates as a shield for the wealthy inhabitants of the six-story building and simultaneously acts as a sword against the destitute individuals on the footpath, a dangerous sociological pressure begins to build.
Resentment.
Exactly. The people on the footpath and the millions who empathize with them eventually stop internalizing the legitimacy of the state. The social thread phrase, not because of anarchy, but because of institutionalized resentment.
So the text argues that for a society to endure, it desperately requires a foundational anchor that sits above the reach of human biases, above legislative lobbying and the self-interest of the ruling class.
Yes. Finding an anchor that transcends human corruption is the eternal problem of statecraft.
Right, because if human laws are perpetually vulnerable to the taint of the lawmaker's self-interest, how does a civilization build a structure that actively strives for universal equity, rather than just managing inequality through force?
That is the big question. And the source material transitions into a rigorous linguistic analysis to provide the alternative, specifically focusing on verse 91 and the implementation of a pivotal Arabic term.
Adallah.
Yes, adala.
Let's focus on that term. It translates literally to the covenant of God or the treaty with God.
That's the literal translation, yeah.
But for a modern, secular listener, encountering a phrase involving a covenant with God immediately conjures images of ancient mysticism or theological dogma.
People think of esoteric religious rituals.
Exactly. The mind leaps to visions of burning incense, sacrificial altars, or highly abstract spiritual pledges. Stuff that seems completely divorced from the hard realities of drafting constitutional law or managing global supply chains.
But the rationalist framework of Allama Parwez demands a complete reevaluation of that mystical assumption.
It's not a magical spell.
No, the text emphasizes that this covenant is not a metaphorical handshake with the divine, nor is it a blind leap of faith, where humanity abdicates responsibility and hopes a supernatural force will balance the municipal budget.
Thank goodness.
Right. It is presented as a highly functional, immensely practical architectural blueprint for maintaining civilization.
So how does it actually work in practice?
Well, Parwez unpacks Adallah as the ultimate supreme formulation of the social contract.
Like Hobbes or Rousseau.
Similar, but with a crucial difference. Traditional secular political philosophy constructs the social contract as a horizontal agreement. It is a pact made between citizens or between the citizenry and the sovereign state. Individuals surrender certain absolute freedoms in exchange for security and order.
But the glaring vulnerability in that horizontal model is human fallibility.
Precisely. A state can turn tyrannical. A majority of citizens can democratically vote to oppress a minority.
Because it's just humans making deals with other humans.
Yeah. Exactly. The concept of Adallah verticalizes the contract. It mandates the establishment of a societal system where God, who within this specific rationalist exegesis operates as the embodiment of absolute, unchangeable, and entirely unbiased justice, is the third party.
So universal values are the third party.
Yes. God, or universal values, is permanently installed as the third party and the ultimate guarantor of every single treaty, promise, and piece of legislation.
Okay, to put that into a concrete scenario for the listener, say two massive global conglomerates sit down to draft a mutually beneficial merger.
Okay.
They might sign a contract that maximizes their quarterly profits while simultaneously deciding to dump toxic runoff into a river that supplies drinking water to a marginalized community downstream.
A classic corporate move, unfortunately.
Right. In a purely horizontal, human-centric legal system, if the paperwork is signed, the loopholes are exploited, and the lobbying money is spent, the contract is deemed legally valid. The state upholds it.
Because the humans agreed to it.
Exactly. However, under the paradigm of Adallah, that contract is fundamentally null and void upon creation. It intrinsically violates the universal values of equity and preservation of life that stand above the profit motives of those two corporations.
Because the ultimate standard of justice is the guarantor, and any agreement that attempts to bypass that standard is illegitimate.
The source text places an uncompromising, almost terrifying weight on the sanctity of this promise, doesn't it?
It really does. It emphasizes that when a civilization, a government, or an individual enters into an agreement under the umbrella of these universal values, the option to renege is entirely removed from the table.
You can't just back out.
No, the linguistic parameters are incredibly firm.
Yeah.
The text specifically condemns the act of swearing an oath, confirming it, ratifying it through diplomatic channels, and then casually discarding it the moment it becomes politically inconvenient.
Or financially burdensome.
Right. Violating an agreement under this framework is not merely a breach of human contract law. It is an assault on the objective moral reality of the universe.
Okay.
When you make the ultimate unbiased standard your guarantor, pulling out of that agreement actively degrades the fragile, invisible web of trust that keeps the human species from descending into pure predatory behavior.
Consider the radical implications of adopting that worldview.
Yeah.
Just think about the agreements that govern our daily lives. From international climate accords and nuclear nonproliferation treaties, all the way down to a standard employment contract, a mortgage agreement, or the deeply personal vows spoken between partners.
It changes everything.
It really does. What would the architecture of human interaction look like if every single commitment was treated not as a fluid document designed by attorneys to maximize escape clauses, but as an inviolable, sacred binding to universal ethics?
It would be a totally different world.
If the act of breaking a contract ceased to be viewed through the cynical lens of a calculated business expense and was instead universally recognized as a dangerous tear in the fundamental fabric of reality.
Implementing that standard would require a total paradigm shift in how we conduct global politics, macroeconomics, and even interpersonal relationships.
Because right now, we reward the exact opposite.
We do. We currently operate within a global culture where discovering the legal loophole, executing the hostile takeover, or finding a way to legally abandon a commitment is frequently lauded as genius.
We call them savvy businessmen.
Exactly. We reward the clever circumvention of trust. But the lecture issues a direct warning that this specific brand of cleverness is the exact psychological mechanism that ensures the eventual destruction of nations.
Which brings us right back to the haunting image of the woman in the dimly lit room.
The yarn metaphor.
Yes. We have established the extraordinary strength and necessity of this social thread, this covenant of universal values. It is the singular technology keeping human society from devouring itself.
The only thing holding it together.
Right. But the agonizing question remains. Why do nations destroy it? We look at history and see advanced, intellectually sophisticated, and incredibly well-resourced civilizations achieve a pinnacle of stability, only to suddenly snap and initiate a process of brutal, methodical self-destruction.
And the exegesis of verse 92 provides the psychological autopsy of this phenomenon. The text explicitly connects the metaphor of the woman unraveling her tightly spun yarn to the historical lifespan and the collective psychology of massive civilizations.
So spinning the yarn is building the empire.
Yes. Building a nation requires an almost unfathomable amount of collective sacrifice. Generations of people endure famine, survive devastating wars, and navigate brutal internal strife. Slowly, over centuries, they painstakingly construct institutions.
They build independent judiciaries.
Universities, resilient infrastructure, complex diplomatic treaties. They back a currency with the sheer force of collective trust. They spend hundreds of years spinning this incredibly complex, vital yarn of a functioning society.
Then, at the apex of their achievement, the psychological shift occurs. After surviving the crucible of their development, after finally securing dominance and wealth, the architects of the civilization sit down and begin to rip the entire structure to shreds.
Because they succumb to the intoxication of arrogance.
The political class begins to engage in blatant, unashamed deception. They sign international treaties with the premeditated intention of violating them. They systematically exploit the weaker nations on their borders.
And through these actions, they actively obliterate the centuries of hard-won trust and structural integrity that their ancestors bled into the soil to establish.
The irony embedded in this historical cycle is almost unbearable to observe. The fatal blow to a truly dominant civilization rarely, if ever, comes purely from a foreign invader striking out of the blue.
It's rarely an outside job.
Like the metaphor illustrates, it is not an external enemy taking a pair of scissors to the thread. It is the creator of the thread undoing its own survival mechanism from the inside out.
And the text draws upon profound historical precedents to ground this philosophical point in reality, specifically pointing toward the ancient world-defining superpowers of late antiquity.
Roman Persia?
Yes, the Roman Empire, particularly in its Byzantine era, and the Sassanid Persian Empire.
The undisputed titans of their era, locked in a struggle that defined the geopolitical reality of the known world for centuries.
These empires achieved a scale of power that was previously unimaginable. They commanded vast, globe-spanning territories, possessed immense concentrations of wealth, fielded seemingly invincible militaries.
Yet their eventual catastrophic collapse was not simply the result of a stronger army suddenly appearing on the horizon.
No, their dissolution was the direct consequence of a methodical unraveling of their own social, diplomatic, and ethical fabric over centuries.
They did it to themselves.
They did. They trapped themselves in a cycle of endless, devastating proxy wars. They signed eternal peace treaties like the one negotiated in 532 AD, only to brazenly violate them within a decade the moment they sensed a temporary tactical advantage.
It was a continuous cycle of bad faith, and the internal decay was just as devastating as the external deception. The ruling elites within these empires became so insulated by their wealth, so corrupted by their absolute power, that the social contract completely dissolved.
They focused entirely on exploiting the agrarian and merchant classes through crushing taxation to fund their endless wars.
They were relentlessly clearing the proverbial footpaths to construct ever larger palaces.
Exactly. And eventually, the populations living under these empires simply stopped believing in the legitimacy of the state. The citizens felt no allegiance to a system that offered them nothing but exploitation.
So they just let it fall.
The empires unraveled their own yarn until there was nothing left but a hollowed-out shell, entirely vulnerable to the subsequent rapid expansion of Arab forces, which encountered structures that had already defeated themselves.
Okay, but what exactly is the cognitive engine driving this self-inflicted destruction? That is the mechanism that demands explanation.
Right, why do they do it?
A brilliant, highly educated, strategically minded political class does not wake up one morning and uniformly decide to orchestrate the downfall of their own empire. They don't view themselves as the foolish woman shredding her yarn.
In their minds, they are winning.
Exactly. When a sovereign leader breaks a treaty or implements a crushing tax, they genuinely believe they are executing a masterful stroke of statecraft. What specific psychological distortion causes them to mistake suicide for strategy?
The text provides a chillingly precise diagnosis of that exact cognitive distortion, and it centers entirely on a specific, potent Arabic concept highlighted in verse 92.
The concept of arba. Let's dissect arba, because understanding that term seems to be the key to understanding the entire historical cycle of collapse.
Arba conceptually translates to the perception of being more numerous, wealthier, more advanced, or overwhelmingly stronger than one's counterpart.
Okay.
The text argues that human beings, and by extension massive nation-states, rarely break their fundamental promises out of pure, chaotic malice.
It's not just evil for evil's sake.
No, they violate treaties and discard their moral commitments because of a calculated observation. They look across the negotiating table and perceive that their military is vastly superior, or their GDP is exponentially larger.
So they feel untouchable.
Exactly. They fall prey to the ultimate geopolitical delusion, the belief that overwhelming physical or economic strength grants them immunity from the fundamental laws of cause and effect and exempts them from the requirements of basic morality.
It is the mathematics of hubris. A state looks at a treaty it signed 20 years ago.
Yeah.
At the time of signing, the two nations were relative equals, so the treaty was respected out of mutual deterrence.
Right, they had to respect it.
But 2 decades later, one nation has amassed an army 3 times the size of the other. The leaders look at the document and calculate, we no longer need to honor this. We have the military capacity to simply take the disputed territory, and there is absolutely nothing the other party can do to stop us.
The power dynamic has shifted, therefore our obligations are nullified.
That raw calculation is the absolute bedrock of what modern political science refers to as realpolitik.
Yes. And the lecture makes the connection between ancient imperial hubris and modern political theory incredibly explicit. It levels a scathing, direct critique against Machiavellian philosophy.
Oh, this is fascinating. In the source material, Niccolo Machiavelli's seminal treatise, The Prince, is explicitly categorized as the Bible of devilish politics.
Which is an aggressive stance.
So describing one of the foundational texts of Western political science as devilish politics is heavy. But if you look at the actual mechanics of Machiavelli's advice, the label is entirely accurate.
It really is. Machiavelli systematically severed the concept of statecraft from the concept of morality.
He explicitly instructed rulers that a wise and effective prince must never keep his word when keeping it would operate against his own self-interest.
Or when the original circumstances that necessitated the promise no longer exist. He codified the idea that deceit is not a moral failing, but a vital tool of governance.
And the institutionalization of that deceit is precisely what Parwez is warning against. Machiavellianism teaches that leaders are unbound by their oaths and that betraying an ally the absolute second it yields a strategic advantage is the hallmark of strong leadership.
And zooming out to the broader geopolitical landscape, the text is sounding the alarm regarding the terrifying modern paradigm of the sovereign state.
Right.
In contemporary international relations, born out of the Peace of Westphalia, the sovereign state is recognized as the ultimate supreme authority within its borders.
It acknowledges no higher moral or legal architecture above itself. It operates with absolute accountability to no one but its own power structures.
And the reality of a world governed by unaccountable sovereign states is fundamentally terrifying. When a superpower decides to violate an international treaty, launch an unprovoked invasion, or manipulate global markets, they simply invoke the magic words.
We are acting in the vital interest of our state security.
Exactly. And because they possess the largest nuclear arsenal, or control the global reserve currency, or hold veto power on the UN Security Council, they face zero tangible worldly consequences.
There is no supreme global police force capable of arresting a superpower. They operate within a sphere of complete impunity.
That perceived impunity is the ultimate manifestation of Arba. It is the blinding, intoxicating delusion generated by massive scale. But the central thesis of Parwez's argument is that this absolute sovereignty is a fatal illusion.
Wait, how is it an illusion if they are actually getting away with it in the short term?
Because when a state breaks a treaty to serve its immediate self-interest, it may indeed secure a short-term, highly visible tactical advantage. It might successfully annex a resource-rich province or dominate a vital trade route for a decade.
Okay.
However, the unseen cost of that action is catastrophic. By demonstrating that their commitments are meaningless, they inject a lethal dose of poison directly into the global social fabric.
So the tactical victory guarantees the strategic defeat.
Precisely.
If your strength relies fundamentally on your willingness to deceive, your strength is incredibly brittle. Every single time a state breaks trust to gain an advantage, they are broadcasting a permanent, undeniable signal to the rest of the globe.
Our word is worthless.
They guarantee that no nation will ever engage with them in true good faith again. They force every neighboring country to rapidly accelerate their own military spending, to engage in counter-deception, and to constantly prepare for the inevitable betrayal.
The state that believes it is cleverly outmaneuvering its rivals is actually just setting off a domino effect of global paranoia that leads inexorably to a devastating mutual destruction.
They are not brilliantly managing an empire. They are frantically tearing apart their own yarn, accelerating their own isolation, and labeling it grand strategy.
The synthesis of that dynamic perfectly encapsulates the mechanism of civilizational suicide detailed in the text. But establishing this mechanism forces us to confront a massive, uncomfortable philosophical dilemma.
Let's hear it.
If human nature is so easily corrupted by the impulse of arbor, if the seductive logic of realpolitik constantly threatens to tear apart the fabric of society, why didn't the architect of the universe design a more stable system?
That is the ultimate question of design. If God is positioned as the supreme guarantor of the Adalah, why permit the possibility of the covenant being broken at all?
Why weren't human beings simply hardwired to be peaceful, cooperative, and genetically incapable of breaching their promises?
Right. Why not simply force humanity to exist as a single, harmonious, monolithic community? A reality where the neurological capacity for deceit, theft, and oppression simply does not exist. It would certainly have spared humanity from millennia of warfare and trauma.
The desire for a forced, painless utopia is incredibly understandable, and verse 93 addresses it directly, transitioning the lecture into a profound exploration of what Parwez terms social physics.
Social physics, I love that term.
The text utilizes a fascinating comparative framework, measuring human existence against the operational realities of animals and angels, to explain why a mandatory, perfectly harmonious community would actually defeat the entire purpose of creation.
The comparison between those three states of being is incredibly clarifying. Let's walk through the mechanics of how each entity operates within this framework.
Within this philosophical paradigm, angels represent entities that exist entirely without free will. They are beings of pure, unadulterated obedience.
They execute divine commands with flawless precision because they literally lack the structural capacity to conceptualize or enact rebellion.
Their obedience is perfect, but it is also entirely mechanical.
They function like perfectly coded software. A program doesn't choose to run its code ethically. It simply executes the only instructions it has.
Exactly. Moving to the animal kingdom, animals operate based on instinct, which is a biological form of hardwiring.
Right.
A herd of sheep will never convene a meeting and consciously decide to adopt the predatory pack tactics of a wolf. Conversely, a wolf cannot experience a sudden moral epiphany, feel profound empathy for its prey, and consciously choose to adopt a peaceful, agrarian lifestyle.
Animals operate flawlessly within the rigid parameters of their biological programming. They lack the conscious, moral agency required to act against their own nature.
And applying that logic to humanity reveals the flaw in the utopian desire. If the Creator had forced the human race into a single, perfectly obedient, globally harmonious community where the capacity to lie or wage war was genetically removed,
We wouldn't be achieving any form of moral victory.
we would simply be a massive flock of incredibly well-behaved sheep, or a terrestrial colony of biological angels. We would be safe, but we fundamentally would not be human.
The text asserts that the defining purpose of human existence is the evolution of consciousness through the friction of choice. It is the arduous development of the human soul through the constant, exhausting exercise of moral agency.
Which leads directly to the pivotal concept introduced in verse 93, Yablukum, which translates to the trial, or the test.
Their trial.
The horrifying capacity that humans possess, the ability to break the most sacred contracts, to succumb to immense greed, to orchestrate wars, to construct luxury towers while ignoring the freezing people on the footpath. That very capacity is the trial.
It brings to mind the process of metallurgy, or the forging of steel.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right, you cannot create a blade capable of holding an edge without subjecting the raw iron to extreme heat, violent physical strikes from a hammer, and rapid, shocking cooling.
The friction is necessary.
If you just leave the iron sitting on a shelf in a perfectly safe, temperature-controlled room, it remains a dull, useless lump. The strength of the steel is entirely dependent on the violence of the crucible. The friction of having the choice to do evil and the constant daily resistance against the gravity of our own greed is the hammer striking the iron.
The crucible is a highly accurate representation of Yablukum. The evolution of human consciousness requires the genuine possibility of failure.
So the ultimate test of humanity, the singular reason the yarn of civilization is allowed to be spun and unspun, is to determine whether a society can consciously choose the logic of the covenant.
Can a nation choose to uphold universal values, to enforce absolute equity, and to operate with Ihsan, even when the primal animal impulse of Arba is screaming at them to annihilate their weaker neighbor and seize their resources?
Will humanity choose to elevate itself by honoring a higher contract, or will it regress into a pack of incredibly sophisticated, technologically advanced, nuclear-armed wolves?
Acknowledging that the possibility of evil is necessary for moral evolution makes sense philosophically. But it forces us to confront a brutal, agonizing reality in the present moment.
Because a listener absorbing this right now might be looking at the state of the world and thinking, this philosophical architecture is stunning, but look at the empirical evidence.
Look at the actual functioning of global power.
Exactly. Bad actors, the wolves in this scenario, get away with breaking the rules constantly. Massive predatory states invade weaker nations. Global corporations knowingly poison environments. Politicians blatantly violate their oaths of office, and more often than not, they retire in extreme comfort, surrounded by wealth.
It's infuriating.
If we have the free will to destroy the yarn, and if these Machiavellian powers can completely avoid accountability because they control the judicial systems and the militaries, where is the justice? It feels viscerally like the woman tearing apart the yarn faces no consequences.
Navigating that profound sense of injustice is perhaps the most difficult requirement for anyone attempting to maintain their sanity and moral integrity in a deeply flawed world.
Exhausting.
But the text does not shy away from this despair. Parwez addresses the perceived triumph of the wicked directly through the introduction of a monumental concept known as the law of requital, or mukafati amal.
The law of requital. The concept of an invisible, inescapable ledger. Let's explore the mechanics of this deeply, because the text makes it clear that this is not merely a promise of some distant post-mortem judgment where the bad guys finally get punished in an afterlife.
Not at all. It is presented as an active, continuous, merciless process occurring right now in the physical world.
How does it work?
Parwez constructs Mukafat Imal not as a mystical intervention or a supernatural lightning bolt waiting to strike a corrupt politician, but as a fundamental, immutable law of nature.
Like gravity.
It operates with the exact same cold, inescapable consistency as the laws of thermodynamics or the force of gravity. The foundational premise is that every single action taken in the universe generates a corresponding reaction, not merely on a physical level, but on a moral, sociological, and psychological level.
So if a sovereign state successfully breaks a treaty and avoids any immediate, visible, military or economic punishment simply because no human coalition is powerful enough to enforce the law against them, the universe has not let them off the hook.
Not even close. The very act of executing the deceit fundamentally, biologically, and sociologically degrades their collective character.
It is the reality of internal rot. You cannot repeatedly perform a corrupt action without fundamentally mutating into a corrupt entity.
A nation might secure a massive geopolitical victory through a brilliantly executed lie. But the morning after the victory, the leadership must attempt to govern a society that implicitly knows its entire foundation is built on deception.
And the psychological toll of that deception is ruinous. The source material draws upon severe Quranic warnings to illustrate this, noting that individuals and nations will be questioned about what they used to do.
This questioning is not framed merely as a future interrogation by a divine tribunal. It represents the inevitable historical collision with the consequences of one's own actions.
Because when a civilization constructs its wealth upon a foundation of broken oaths, Machiavellian power plays, and the systematic oppression of the vulnerable, it is unknowingly injecting massive structural instability into its own architecture.
It fosters a pervasive culture of cynicism. The citizens observe the impunity of their leaders and internalize the lesson that trust is a weakness.
Internal cohesion evaporates.
Institutions hollow out because the individuals running them are solely focused on extracting value rather than serving the public. External allies smile in diplomatic meetings while constantly arming themselves and scheming behind the superpower's back.
The ledger balances itself through the sheer weight of consequence. The universe absolutely refuses to let you cheat the system indefinitely.
A ruling class can lie to the opposing nation, they can deploy sophisticated propaganda to lie to their own citizens, and they can even engage in enough cognitive dissonance to lie to themselves. But they cannot deceive the fundamental physics of sociological reality.
A society operating on the logic of arba and deceit will eventually, inevitably, face humiliation, total degradation, and a catastrophic collapse generated entirely from within its own borders.
This society becomes deeply paranoid, financially exhausted by its own endless security measures, and structurally brittle.
And that collapse is the final, tragic, and inevitable unraveling of the yarn. They achieve their own destruction because they possess the sheer arrogance to violate the fundamental laws of social gravity that were designed to keep them standing.
Recognizing the reality of Mukafat-e-Amal is a sobering, heavy experience, yet it provides a profound layer of structural comfort.
It philosophically guarantees that justice is not merely a naive human aspiration, but a hard-coded, structural reality of the universe itself.
The arrogance of the powerful and the deployment of deceit inherently carry the dormant seeds of their own inevitable destruction. The illusion of Arba, the belief that sheer numbers, wealth, and lies can conquer reality, is ultimately exposed as the most fatal vulnerability a civilization can possess.
The scope of what we have explored today is massive. We have journeyed from the glaring, tragic insufficiencies of purely man-made legal codes, the sterile justice that forcefully clears the destitute from the footpaths while resolutely ignoring their humanity,
to the profound concept of the Adala, the unbreakable covenant of God that demands the absolute pursuit of universal equity.
We have dissected the absurd, self-destructive foolishness of empires unraveling their own societal yarn for the sake of fleeting Machiavellian power. And we have confronted the reality that our free will, our terrifying ability to choose the path of destruction, is not a flaw in the design of the universe, but the essential, agonizing crucible required for our conscious evolution.
It's been an intense journey.
We've seen the danger of unraveling the social thread. In Lecture 1015, covering Ayat 94-99, we will explore the psychology of the slipping foot, why small compromises in integrity lead to a total loss of social grounding, and how to find Hayat an-Tayyiba, the pure life.
While we spend our time today analyzing massive historical forces, ancient empires, and the grand betrayals of modern sovereign states, the physics of the yarn applies just as ruthlessly to the individual.
So true.
Consider the architecture of your own life. Identify a commitment, a relationship, or a personal standard of integrity that you have labored incredibly hard, day after day, year after year, to spin into existence. Then ask yourself the difficult question. Are there any areas in your life where, perhaps in pursuit of a tiny, fleeting advantage or a brief moment of convenience, you are quietly, almost subconsciously, pulling at that very thread with your own hands?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The material is heavy, but understanding the physics of our own survival is the most essential work we can do. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep learning the lessons of the past, and above all else, ensure your own threads remain tightly, honestly woven. Until next time.